Looking to add to his tally as the top ace of World War II, Richard Bong prowled the skies over in January 1943. In a small lake below, something caught his eye. 3 downed American pilots were drifting in a rubber raft. Bong circled above, providing cover. Instead of a threat in the air, he saw movement in the water. Fast, silent, closing in. Bong swore. He wasn't a sharpshooter. He earned his kills up close, nose to nose. From this height, he wouldn't hit a thing. He dropped lower, dangerously close to the water. His target came into view, a massive prehistoric nightmare. The biggest crocodile he'd ever seen, just feet from the raft. Bong's hands clenched the stick. He lined up his 20mm cannon. 1 inch off, and he'd take out his own men. 1942. The world was at war. General George C. Kenney, commander of the 4th Air Force, had far more pressing matters on his plate than chasing down reckless joyriders. He was responsible for the defense of the entire U.S. Pacific coast. But that day, his attention was derailed by something altogether different. A young pilot turning San Francisco into his personal air show. On Kenney's desk sat a pile of reports detailing an incident that read like a Hollywood stunt reel. A P-38 Lightning had been seen flying loops around the Golden Gate Bridge, then tearing along Market Street at dangerously low altitude. It was honestly impressive, but utterly irresponsible. To make matters worse, an angry woman from Oakland was on the phone. Furious, she demanded that the pilot who'd buzzed her house so low return and hang all her laundry back on the clotheslines. Kenney had had enough. He assured the woman he would take care of it, then summoned the pilot to his office. In his mind, the decision was made. The boy would be court-martialed. But when the door opened, what entered wasn't the brash, cocksure show-off he'd imagined. Instead, in walked a little blonde Swedish-looking kid, no taller than 5'6", with a round pink baby face and the bluest, most innocent eyes Kenney had ever seen. Quiet, calm, visibly afraid. Kenney unloaded on him. 20 minutes of stern dressing down, threats of court-martial, and the very real warning that he might never fly again. The boy just nodded, apologetic, saying little. And then, unable to help himself, Kenney asked, quote, "By the way, wasn't the air pretty rough down in the street around the 2nd-story level?" He was remembering his own cadet days, diving an old biplane to treetop height just for the thrill. The boy's expression changed. His eyes flickered with excitement, and he answered, quote, "Yes, sir. It was kind of rough, but it was easy to control the plane. The aileron control is good in the P-38, and..." He stopped himself, embarrassed. Kenney saw himself in the kid, and he understood. They would need more like him in the hard days ahead. He gave a final order. No more of that nonsense. Then he sent him to Oakland, adding, quote, "If that woman has any washing to be hung out on the line, you do it for her. Then you hang around being useful, mowing a lawn or something." The boy accepted and kept his promise. A few days later, General Henry H. Arnold called. Kenney was to report to Washington immediately. He was appointed commander of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific. He would be allowed to take 50 P-38s and 50 of his best pilots. The first name that came to mind, 2nd Lieutenant Richard I. Bong, the boy who looped the Golden Gate Bridge. The race to become the top ace in the Pacific began not in the skies, but in the mess hall, when none other than Eddie Rickenbacker, a legendary World War I fighter ace, arrived in New Guinea. He had been sent by Washington as a morale booster and personal advisor to General George Kenney. That afternoon, the young pilots crowded around Rickenbacker, captivated as he recounted his stories. Kenney addressed the group, recounting how the veteran ace had shot down 26 enemies in just a few months in 1918. Rickenbacker offered a modest correction, almost sheepishly, quote, "Well, of course, you have to remember that the Germans were pretty thick on the front in those days." A moment of silence followed, until Dick Bong's quiet voice broke it, shy and unassuming, quote, "Captain Rickenbacker, the Japs are pretty thick over here, too." They all laughed. That gave Kenney an idea. He offered a case of scotch for any pilot who could break Rickenbacker's record. The World War I ace added a second case to the pot. Even General Douglas MacArthur caught wind of the wager and threw in his own reward, a case of champagne, he said, to taper off the whiskey. With that, an unofficial challenge took shape. A race had begun. At the time, several of Kenny's pilots had already downed 2 or 3 enemy planes. Bong, however, had yet to see combat. But that changed during the final week of December 1942. The Japanese had grown accustomed to limited resistance in the air. Few had yet encountered the P-38 Lightning, and none had seen it used in coordinated combat. When radar at Lolokia Strip picked up a large enemy formation approaching from the north, Captain Tommy Lynch led 12 P-38s into the skies. It was the first real engagement for Kenny's boys. They met the enemy just as 25 Japanese fighters and bombers crested the Owen Stanley Mountains. What followed was a sudden and ferocious dogfight. The Japanese were completely unprepared for the aggressive coordination, for the speed and power of the American aircraft, and for the ambush that awaited them. Though the Zero could outturn the P-38, it was no match for its speed, climb rate, or firepower. That day, all advantages belonged to the Americans. The result, 15 enemy aircraft destroyed. Not a single American lost. Bong personally downed 2 Zeros. Unlike his squad mates, who returned to base, excitedly scribbling down vivid accounts of the battle, Bong's report was characteristically terse. The takeoff time, the exact times of each victory, and the landing. Nothing more. That evening, General Ennis Whitehead debriefed the fight with Kenny. The general made his prediction, quote, "Watch that boy, Bong. There's the top American ace of aces at this war. He just started working today." Whitehead placed his own bet on Tommy Lynch, citing his leadership and experience, but Kenny wasn't swayed. He added, quote, "At least until the day he realizes that he's shooting people instead of clay pigeons." The Zero came screaming out of the sun on January 7th, 1943, its engine howling like a banshee as Dick Bong's squadron escorted bombers toward the Japanese convoy at Huon Gulf. The enemy pilot rolled inverted and dove hard, trying to slash through their formation, but Bong was already moving, his P-38 Lightning responding instantly to his touch. He kicked the rudder, slammed the stick forward, and suddenly, he was behind the Zero. The Lightning's 450 caliber and single 20mm cannon erupted in a devastating convergence of fire. The Zero disintegrated. The pilot's body tumbled free, no parachute. Bong didn't watch him fall. There were more coming. 2 Zeros materialized from nowhere, diving on the bombers. Bong rolled hard left and pulled into a climbing turn that would have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. The G-forces crushed him into his seat, his vision tunneling as he fought to keep the lead Zero in sight. At the perfect moment, he reversed, catching the enemy pilot completely off guard. Another burst, another victory. The Zero exploded in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. The second enemy fighter tried to run, but the P-38 was the fastest thing in the Pacific sky. Bong closed the distance mercilessly, his twin engines roaring as he lined up the shot. The Zero pilot jinked desperately, to no avail. The fight ended quickly. Bong had downed 3 enemies in 2 days. He was an ace. Still, he kept his calm and approachable demeanor, always eager to help first and seek glory later. One day, while providing air cover for 3 fellow pilots crossing a lake in a small rubber boat to rescue a downed comrade, Bong spotted a large crocodile trailing the boat. He descended as low as he could, a skill he had mastered by now, and with a well-placed burst of 20mm cannon fire, he eliminated the reptile threat. This act earned him the tongue-in-cheek distinction of being the founding member of the Crocodile Club. He was such a gentleman that some of his wingmen became increasingly frustrated with him. One night, one of them walked up to General Kenny, looking furious, and complained about Bong giving away victories. Kenny asked the pilot to elaborate. He explained that Bong had fired a burst into an enemy Zero, destroying one of its wings. Instead of finishing it off, he jumped to another, and then he radioed him to finish it off. The wingman destroyed the Zero, but after landing, he confronted Bong. When told that it should go on his tally, Bong replied, quote, "Oh no, he's yours. I just grazed him." Kenny didn't want to hear another word. He told the wingman not to bring it up again. To him, this was between Bong and his wingmen. The general knew being a wingman for an aggressive ace was one of the most dangerous jobs in the war, and if Bong wanted to share some of the glory with them, it was fine with him. Weeks later, over the Bismarck Sea, Bong's group was covering bombers as they hammered a Japanese convoy off Finschhafen. The Zero appeared like a ghost, trying to slip past their screen. Bong spotted him first, as he always did, and dove. The Japanese pilot was very skilled, twisting and turning in ways that would have thrown off most opponents. But Bong had learned to think like the enemy, to anticipate their moves before they made them. When the Zero pilot committed to a climbing turn, Bong was already there, waiting. His sixth victory tumbled into the sea. Then came July 26th, and all hell broke loose over Cape Gloucester. Bong was following a flight of Zeros when something made him glance down. There, a damaged P-38 limping along, one engine gone, a Zero closing in. Without hesitation, Bong rolled inverted and pulled through, diving between them. The enemy pilot, sensing easier prey, turned on Bong. Bong feathered his right engine and let his lightning slow dramatically. To the Japanese pilot, he looked like another wounded bird. The Zero closed eagerly, its pilot already tasting victory. But as soon as the damaged P-38 disappeared into the clouds, Bong slammed the throttle forward, both engines roaring back to life. The P-38 leapt forward like it had been shot from a cannon. In seconds, he reversed positions, sitting on the Zero's tail. One long burst, and number 11 joined his growing tally. But something was wrong. The lightning was shaking violently. Bong's hands danced across the controls as he nursed her towards Marillaman Field. The landing was more a controlled crash than a touchdown, with no brakes, a flat tire, and the aircraft sliding sideways off the runway. When they examined the wreckage, even the hardened crew chiefs went pale. Half the tail was gone. 50-plus bullet holes peppered the fuselage and wings. The armor plate behind Bong's head looked like someone had worked it over with a ball-peen hammer. Bong just grinned and said, quote, "Boy, I'll bet that Jap wondered what kept that P-38 flying." By now, General Kenny was not the only one who believed Bong might be the next ace of aces. Bong, now a captain, was known throughout the Pacific as a rising star, and back home, he was a war hero. When Bong was sent home on leave in late 1942 after his first combat tour, he did what many young servicemen did. He went looking for love. At a Superior State Teachers College homecoming event in Wisconsin, he met Marge Vattendahl, a pretty brunette student. They dated throughout his leave, and when it came time for him to return to the Pacific, Bong was smitten. Like many pilots who painted their sweethearts' names on their planes, Bong christened his P-38 Lightning Marge in her honor. But he went one step further. He had her portrait painted on the nose of his fighter, a beautiful image of Marge in an elegant pose that became one of the most famous Noah's Art images of the war. But Bong was not just home on a leisure trip. He was put to work as a celebrity war hero, selling war bonds. The military recognized that one of America's top aces was worth more as a propaganda tool than just another combat pilot. Bong toured across the country, appearing at rallies, factories, and public events to promote war bond sales. He'd speak to crowds about his experiences in the Pacific, sign autographs, and pose for photos with workers and bond buyers. The shy farm boy from Wisconsin wasn't naturally comfortable in the spotlight, but he understood his duty extended beyond the cockpit. By the end of January, Bong was flying back to New Guinea. Being a superstar and touring from town to town was more exhausting to the shy farm boy than aircraft combat. Bong was a famous fighting ace, but he had not yet won the race for the title of Ace of Aces, and he faced fierce competition. Fellow pilot Neil Kirby was determined to win the title, and he dramatically overshadowed Bong on October 11, 1943. During that mission, Kirby led 3 other pilots, known as his 3 Musketeers, on a sweep over Wewak. When they spotted what appeared to be a single Japanese plane, they dove to attack, only to discover a massive formation of 33 bombers and 12 fighters. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Kirby attacked without hesitation, shooting down 3 planes in his initial pass, then reversing course to destroy 2 more. His wingman also scored victories during the engagement. Gun camera footage confirmed 6 victories for Kirby, though the camera ran out of film just as he engaged a 7th enemy aircraft. There were talks about giving him the Medal of Honor. The radio crackled to life on January 20th, 1944, bringing news that would shake the very foundation of the ace race. Neil Kirby's Medal of Honor had been approved. The ceremony left Kirby so overwhelmed he could barely speak, except to promise he'd prove himself worthy by shooting down even more Japanese planes. By then, the scoreboard told a brutal story. Kirby had clawed his way to 20 victories, just one behind Dick Bong. The race that had begun with Eddie Rickenbacker's challenge was now a knife-edge competition between 2 very different men, the aggressive, glory-hungry Kirby and the quiet, methodical Bong. Kenny tried to rein in his competitive ace, quote, "Shoot down one and get out. You'll live forever that way. But if you keep going back for seconds and thirds, you're asking for trouble." Kirby listened politely, but his eyes burned with ambition, quote, "I'd like to get an even 50 before I go home." Tommy Lynch had returned to the fight, anxious to catch up after his leave. The former leader now trailed both Bong and Kirby, needing 4 victories to tie Bong and 5 to match Kirby. The race had become a 3-way sprint, with other aces like Major George Welch and Captain Roberts closing in from behind. Then came February 27th. The afternoon started routinely. Radar picked up a Japanese transport approaching from Rabaul. But the information arrived almost too late for an interception. Bong and Lynch scrambled into the air, racing against time. They caught the enemy aircraft before it would have reached the safety of its landing approach. Lynch dove first, his guns chattering, but something went wrong. In his eagerness to attack, he'd forgotten to arm his weapons. Bong didn't hesitate. His burst hit just as the transport touched the runway. Fire bloomed. Ground guns erupted. The Americans escaped under a storm of lead. General Kenny wanted to give Bong the credit, begged him. Maybe the plane bounced, or maybe it was still airborne. Bong didn't flinch. It was on the ground, all right. He'd win the title, but only if he earned it. Later that day, radio intercepts revealed the transport had claimed a major general, a brigadier, and an entire staff of high-ranking officers. Things continued to worsen by the day. On March 4th, Kirby was leading a fighter sweep when they encountered Japanese fighters. After masterfully eliminating 2 Japanese warplanes, Kirby took an unnecessary risk. He followed a damaged Japanese bomber down to low altitude to finish it off. 3 Japanese fighters pounced on his vulnerable position. His wingman took out 2 of the Zeros, but the third placed a burst of fire right at the center of Kirby's canopy. The P-38 never recovered from the dive, and no parachute was ever deployed. Kirby's loss at age 32 shocked the Air Force and eliminated Bong's closest competition. But the tragedy was not over. On March 9th, Bong and Lynch flew another patrol over Taji, searching for targets. Finding no aircraft, they turned their guns on Japanese luggers offshore. Lynch's P-38 suddenly pulled up sharply, one engine smoking. Dick Bong watched in growing horror as he saw, in quick succession, a propeller flying off, Tommy reaching for his parachute, and then the plane exploding in a massive fireball. Bong circled for several minutes, desperately searching for any sign that his friend had survived. There was nothing. Lynch's P-38 had disintegrated completely. The chute had burned with the explosion. Tommy Lynch, with 20 victories, one of the greatest fighter pilots of the war, was gone in an instant. March would claim another ace. Edward Cragg, credited with 15 victories, fell over Gloucester on December 26, 1943, though word hadn't reached them until now. The attrition was mounting. The very best were being shot down. Then came April 3rd, and Bong's most controversial victory. Escorting bombers over Hollandia, he tangled with a Japanese fighter and sent it down. But his gun camera wasn't installed that day. Without witness confirmation or wreckage, the victory couldn't be officially credited. Bong showed Kenny exactly where the plane went down. He'd even noted that it was an Oscar, not a Zero, with the pilot and engine intact, though the left wing was shot off. Kenny promised, quote, When we capture Hollandia, I'll send a diver. Bong was incredibly frustrated. All he needed was that victory to break Rickenbacker's record. But he didn't stay idle. By April 12, 1943, during a raid on Hollandia, Bong scored 2 confirmed downings, bringing his official count to 27. The news reached General Arnold in Washington, who immediately sent word to Eddie Rickenbacker. The old ace's record had finally fallen. 2 weeks later, true to his word, a diver found the Oscar exactly where Bong had indicated. Kenny issued the order, quote, "Credit Captain Richard I. Bong with his 28th victory." As Arnold arranged to bring Bong home for a hero's tour, controversy was already brewing. The race had cost too much. Back in Washington, critics were sharpening their knives, ready to accuse Kenny of trading lives for headlines. Bong was promoted to major, but more importantly, he was officially the American ace of aces. But the friendly promise of giving the winner of the race whiskey cases soon gave Bong's amazing victory a bitter taste. True to their promises, the cases began arriving. Rickenbacker's scotch, MacArthur's champagne, and even General Arnold sent Coca-Colas, knowing Bong preferred soda. Then, the story hit the newspapers. What had been a private military tradition exploded into a national scandal. Rickenbacker rewards ace with whiskey, screamed headlines across America. The timing couldn't have been worse. It was 1944, an election year, with campaigns for a new president and Congress in full swing. Prohibition societies mobilized immediately, flooding newspapers and military offices with angry letters. Critics accused the military of, quote, "seducing our pilots with liquor to carry out their missions and bribing American youth with booze." But many others supported Rickenbacker, Bong, and what they saw as a harmless incentive for men who risked their lives every day. Within 48 hours, Rickenbacker reported receiving dozens of offers of whiskey from supporters, starting with a nightclub owner in Nogales, Mexico. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew Bong. The quiet farm boy from Wisconsin didn't even drink. When he threw a celebration party in New Guinea, inviting pilots and bomber crews to share in the famous liquor cache, there were so many attendees that each person barely managed a single drink. Still, the critics were louder. General Arnold, perhaps sensing the political damage, quickly arranged for Bong to return stateside, not for celebration, but for a, quote, gunnery instruction assignment that would keep America's new ace of aces safely out of combat, and perhaps more importantly, away from any more controversial toasts. Richard Bong may have been grounded from frontline combat in name, but fate had placed him in one of the few instructor positions where war could still find you every morning. After a brief time in the States, he was stationed in New Guinea, first at Port Moresby, then Dobodura, Nadzab, and eventually Tacloban in the Philippines, as a gunnery instructor under the 5th Air Force. Officially, his job was to train replacement pilots, most of them fresh from the States. But New Guinea in 1944 wasn't the rear, it was the bleeding edge. Japanese fighters still prowled the skies out of Hollandia, Wewak, and Rabaul. Air raids were frequent. Recon flights spotted enemy convoys every other day, and from those rough airfields carved into the jungle, a P-38 could reach an active combat zone in under an hour. This perhaps was the genius, or the accident, of Bong's continued tally. His training flights doubled as combat patrols. A mock interception could turn real in minutes. Bong flew often, more than some active duty pilots, and always with his signature calm. He would take off alongside green flyers, drill them on formation and gunnery, and spot a glint of aluminum over the Bismarck Sea, and calmly call out the contact. The greenhorns watched their instructor roll into a dive, press into his seat as G's pulled his vision tight, and then one burst, two, a plume of fire, and the enemy was gone. Bong would rejoin the formation like nothing had happened. Between April and October 1944, Bong's tally grew from 28 to 40. By the time the Americans launched their campaign to retake the Philippines in October, Bong was stationed at Tacloban, still instructing. The air over Leyte was thick with Zeros. Bong, still technically non-combat, downed 8 Japanese aircraft in 16 days. Kenny kept quiet. As long as Bong was flying, pilots were learning and surviving. Finally, in November, Kenny called him in, saying, quote, "Dick, you've done enough. It's time to go home." Bong nodded. He didn't argue. He never did. He packed up his few belongings, folded his Marge Nozart poster, and boarded a transport headed stateside. He left the Pacific with 40 confirmed victories, a record no American pilot has ever surpassed, and likely never will. Kenny, however, felt obliged to recommend him for the Medal of Honor. He knew Bong deserved it as much as any other pilot who had received it. The citation detailed his extraordinary courage, singling out his actions over Leyte, where, despite not being required to fight, he had personally downed enemy aircraft while protecting American bombers and mentoring inexperienced pilots in the midst of combat. Reporters rushed to capture his words. Bong smiled awkwardly, hands behind his back. His only words were, quote, "I was just trying to protect the boys." Back in Wisconsin, his hometown threw a parade. At Bond rallies, he was met with standing ovations. But when the cheering died down, Bong returned to the quiet life, writing letters to Marge, visiting factories, and following orders. He wasn't comfortable in the spotlight. He never had been. The ace of aces had come home. Major Richard Bong had done his duty, more than any other man alive, perhaps, but he was only 24 years old, and he still wanted to fly. In early 1945, after a brief stint promoting war bonds and marrying his sweetheart, Marjorie Vattendahl, in February, Bong reported for a new assignment, test pilot at Wright Field in Ohio, the cutting edge of military aviation. It was a quieter war, but no less dangerous. The U.S. Army Air Forces were rushing to perfect a new generation of fighter aircraft, jets. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was America's first operational jet-powered fighter, a technological leap designed to match or surpass German Me-262s and British Meteors already appearing in Europe. Bong, with his combat record and deep familiarity with Lockheed aircraft, was a natural candidate to help test the design. The P-80 was fast, sleek, and temperamental. Test flights pushed the limits of materials, engines, and human tolerance. On August 6, 1945, the same morning the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, Richard Bong took off in a P-80A, serial number 4485048, from Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank, California. It was a routine acceptance flight, meant to evaluate the engine performance before delivery. But something went wrong almost immediately after takeoff. Witnesses reported seeing white smoke trailing from the aircraft. The engine, a General Electric J-33 turbojet, had flamed out, possibly due to a malfunction in the fuel pump. Witnesses reported seeing him attempt to escape the aircraft, but at such a low altitude, probably only a few hundred feet, and with the aircraft already in an uncontrolled state, he was unable to clear the plane and deploy his parachute in time. The P-80 crashed into a field, and America's top ace was gone. It was a tragic end for someone who had survived 146 combat missions and over 500 combat hours against the Japanese. Marge, listening to the news that evening, heard about Hiroshima, and then, minutes later, the loss of her husband. The next day, both news stories shared the front page. The nation mourned. President Truman issued a statement of condolence. General Kenny wept. Thousands attended his funeral in Poplar, Wisconsin, where Bong was laid to rest with full military honors. Richard Bong never set out to be a hero. That's precisely why he became one.